I'm Richard Johnson, and my granddaughter asked me to give her a little history around the Vietnam era. And I'll start out by saying that the Vietnam War started in 1954. Most people thought that it was in the 60s, and it was very prominent in the 60s, but it started earlier than that. It spilled over into Laos and Cambodia in the 70s. At that time, I was in the Korean War in the 50s, 53 through 57, and the Korean War was very similar to the Vietnam War in the fact that it started because of the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Cold War era. And through that whole time frame, the warring two people that didn't really fight the war, but they were backing, Russia backing the communism, and the U.S. the democracy in Vietnam and Korea. The forces at that time, when I was in Korea, we were training the South Vietnamese to use our ships. I was on a destroyer, and we trained the Vietnam sailors, who became the Vietnam sailors, to handle our ships. And then we turned over some of our destroyer escorts, which I was on one, turned them over to them to operate.
Can you explain where you were in your life as the Vietnam War was taking place, personally and or professionally?
Well, professionally, when it first started in 1954, I was still in the Navy in the waters of where Vietnam was. And even though the official war hadn't started, there was fighting going on between the communists and the Vietnamese nationalists. And when we were going up the Saigon River, they were shooting across the river, and we had to go to general quarters to, now they were just shooting light arms like rifles and that type of thing. It didn't hurt anybody on the ship, but that was going on then. So it started back then. So, you know, and of course I was in the service and doing exactly what you do is run the ship, and I think that was basically it. That was my personal life.
What was your perspective on the war as it was happening? Did you agree or disagree?
Well, the Vietnam War was started again by Russia and the United States being at odds with each other in the Cold War, and so they took sides. I thought that we should have never been in Vietnam. There was nothing that I thought we could gain, and I believe the way the territory was laid out, the swamps and the rice paddies and so forth, it was a terrible place to fight a war. Totally opposite than it was in Korea, where it was cold and where soldiers had frostbite, and as many were maimed and hurt by frostbite as there was bullets. In Vietnam, it was in the rice paddies, it was malaria, it was napalm bombs, it was insects, the typhoid fever, it had everything. And the men went through literally hell there of trying to fight a battle in the swamps of Vietnam. I did not see any reason that you would be fighting for this. There was nothing there, and it was just fighting for territorial takeover, as it was in Korea. Korea we never did win. We went to the 38th parallel, we were stopped, They signed a treaty there, and the war ended. But we did not accomplish the goal, and the goal was to turn it into a democracy. At the 38th parallel, it was on one side it was communist, on the other side it was democracy. That's what they were trying to do in Vietnam, and it did not work.
What is your perspective on the Vietnam War now? How and why has it changed?
My perspective hasn't changed at all. We shouldn't have been there. We didn't gain anything. We lost a lot of men. We have decided in this country that we need to police every part of the world. And I do not believe that, as big as this world is, we cannot police every area. And I think a good example is where we are today. We're over in Afghanistan, and we'll not win that war either. We'll go out of there, and my idea is we'll go right back the way it was. So I did not change my opinion. I think we need to stop trying to change everybody in the world, because we'll never be able to do it.
Did you know someone who fought in Vietnam?
Yes, I did. I knew several people, but the one closest would have been my cousin. He was 3-4 years younger than I, so I was in Korea, he was in Vietnam, and he was in the Army, and he saw action over there. He said it was a terrible, terrible place, in the fact that it was fought in the rice paddies, and it was not like it was all bombing cities and so forth. This was just out in the nowhere, and snipers and everything else. So it was not a good thing, and he did not give me a lot of detail on it.
This was the first televised war. Did you watch the stories they showed on TV? And how did the media impact the war, in your opinion?
Of course. I watched the news, the evening news and so forth, and kept up. Being a veteran of Korea, I was interested. The thing that I believe that media did for that particular war versus Korea was that, and even World War II, was the fact that the people here in the United States saw a better, they saw more of what was happening on a day-to-day basis. It was the first time they had even been able to view what some of the things that happened in the war. However, the newsreels still did not show what really goes on in a war. That was mild compared to what really happens. So, did it influence it? Of course it did, because a lot of people thought we hadn't ought to be there, and so they were doing the protests. I was in the Midwest, where the protests were not that strong. It was more on the coast, especially California, and that was in the era of the hippies and all of that, and there was so many more of those type of protests out on the West Coast. Yes, it had a big influence. I think that was why we ended up eventually getting out of there, because of people just being mad about us being there.
Like you said, you fought in Korea. From everything that you know, how is the impact of Vietnam different from the impact of Korea?
Well, the end result was, in my mind, pretty much the same. The only thing, Korea, we did fight up to the 38th parallel, and then there was a truce, and it was over. We didn't solve the problem, because we're dealing with it today. North Korea is bound to get involved again. And of course, just like before, Russia and China would love for us to get involved again. Vietnam, it was no win. We didn't do a thing there. We didn't change anything, and then the end result was the communists won. It was just as plain, and we couldn't possibly win there, and we didn't.
This war was heavily protested. How aware were you of the protests around the country, and did you agree with them?
Well, I was fully aware of the protests, and I think in a democratic society we ought to be able to express our opinions. I do not like the idea of the protests that get violent, and both sides, when you're on a subject, ought to be able to give their points of view, but it does not have to get hostile, and it does not have to have bloodshed. I think the part that I would never go against people saying what their politics or what they believe in. But lots of times people that protest do not have any idea why they're protesting. They think they know, but they have no idea what really happens in a war unless they've been there. And so, I don't want to take away the freedom for people, because that's what we all go to war for, is to keep the freedom for this country. And if all these young men and women haven't died for this country, we would be like the communist countries.
What was your view of the government and the presidential administrations at this time?
The government the presidents at the time of most of the time that we were in Vietnam was President Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. The first part of the war was we were trying to help the South Vietnamese to maintain and fight the war by supplying materials, guns, ammunition, and we did a lot of helping to train their soldiers to fight the war. The first part of that war was done mostly with aircraft and was not so much of the ground troops as it was later on in the war. Up until the Gulf of Tonkin, when our ship was bombarded there, that's when we really started putting more of our people in there, not just in an advisory type plan. It was, we were in there to fight. And the soldiers, we put a lot of Marines, Army, backed up by the Navy and the Air Force. But we put in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of soldiers and sailors and Marines, and then we just kept adding to it as we got further into the ground war. When President Nixon took over, expanded the ground troops even more, and then's when we got into the real dirty part of the war, where we were fighting in the rice paddies, and napalm bombs were used, a lot of insects, a lot of soldiers getting malaria. There was a tremendous amount of people getting hurt, not just from the bullets, but from all the elements that they were fighting in. We were losing a lot of people, and by then North Korea had brought in their supply of soldiers and started fighting the communists besides the North Vietnamese. This went on, but as it went on, we started losing more and more people. We were not gaining any ground, any territory, and it just seemed to be getting worse. We finally, towards the end, we just had to get out of there. The fall of Saigon, that was really bad, and we had to get in there and get our troops and our people out, and we did get them out, and in fact we lost the war, and in a war that we should never have been in there in the first place. We had no way of winning it.
How did music impact the Vietnam era from your perspective?
The Vietnam War sparked a lot of people protesting against the war, and a lot of music was coming out at that time with the theme of protesting against the war. That was in the hippie era. The Midwest wasn't as involved in the protests as it was more on the coast, especially on the West Coast. San Francisco, at the time we were in San Francisco, and the hippies were running their protests all over the city of San Francisco, and they would block off traffic and stop the country from moving ahead in a lot of ways, because they were so upset over the war. Looking back on that, they were right. We shouldn't have been there in the first place, and we ended up losing a lot of people and never gained anything really. The music, I was not that much into the music of the time, being a country western fan. That didn't quite fit into the music that I listened to. But otherwise it had a bearing, because those protests and that music got the politicians thinking more and more, and there was pressure put on them to get out of Vietnam. And of course we ended up getting out.
What was the overall feeling of the Vietnam War and era? How did that impact the world?
Politics plays a big role whenever we get involved in one of these skirmishes out of this country. The Vietnam War, of course, was really caused by the Russians and Chinese backing the North Vietnamese, and we backing the South Vietnam. And when this is done, it's all done by politics. All of our men are sent over there by the politicians. They're not there because they want to be there. They're there because our politics says we ought to be there, and many times we should not be there. And Vietnam was one of those in spades, that we should not have been there. The overall result of these type of skirmishes is we do make a lot of enemies. We are helping people, but in many cases we're harming countries because they don't realize that we are trying to help. We're running into the same thing in Afghanistan. We'll probably end up there when we get out, that the Taliban will take back over, and the skirmishes will, a lot of these are within their own country, and those skirmishes will probably continue. The moral of all of this is, I think in politics we need to change our philosophy. we cannot turn everybody into a democratic society. They have to take some pride in their countries, and if they want democracy, they got to work for it. Our country, we've worked for our democracy, and that's how we've lost our soldiers, and they've done a tremendous job in keeping our country safe. We're not over yet, because a lot of people in these foreign countries do not like us. They'll take our money, but they really don't want us to tell them what to do, and we try to do that sometimes, and we shouldn't be doing that. The end result of all this we'll see, but I think we need to start more protection of our own shores. We've got to help the world to be a democratic world and not a socialistic or communist country. People today need to be more involved in our country's being and work with politicians to convince them that we should not be in some of the skirmishes. We still got to protect our country, we got to protect our democracy, but we don't need to be in places that people hate us and we come out of there like we did out of Vietnam. This is the thing that will go on. There's always going to be wars and histories of wars, but we need to limit our involvement where we have no benefit from it.